if there's a hurricane headed toward the East Coast, you can count on days of breathless coverage, including stand-ups from reporters toughing out the wind and rain and interviews with residents who inexplicably refuse to evacuate. But when it comes to the wildfires ravaging the West Coast, specifically California, the media's interest doesn't seem to stack up. Adam Riley has more.
We're standing in the rubble of what was somebody's home.
It's not that the wildfires ravaging California haven't been covered. Actually, they have.
Santa Ana winds fueling dangerous new flare-ups today,
rendering the air virtually unbreathable.
They have never seen anything like this. It is just mind-boggling.
Still, several critics thought the coverage was inadequate, including Dan Rather, who tweeted, "The full extent of this natural disaster hasn't penetrated the Northeast news bubble enough." Turns out he has a point. When the Washington Post's Philip Bump crunched the numbers, he found that cable news coverage of hurricanes, shown here in green, swamped coverage of wildfires, shown in red. So why the discrepancy?
Woo! That gust took me off my feet there.
Maybe it's those hackneyed hurricane live shots, which give reporters a chance to look extra rugged. Maybe it's because hurricanes have the potential to affect a much wider area, which means a lot more viewers. Or maybe it's because the East Coast media is obsessed with the East Coast. After all, if a disaster like the Camp Fire happened around New York or Washington...
Over 1,000 people are unaccounted for. Think about that. Over 1,000 people unaccounted for.
The media might not cover anything else.
Well, I did make that point on radio a few weeks ago, that the fact that this is not an East Coast phenomenon definitely plays into how much coverage, because if it had been, it would have been wall-to-wall coverage. The one thing I push back on a little bit on that New York Washington Post crunching is there was a lot of coverage. And, these hurricanes come in waves, and there's much more of them, and, they last for days. Not that this didn't last for days, but you have these convergences of them. There was some excellent reporting on the wildfires, including on radio, by the way. NPR has done a lot. And I was riveted by the coverage itself. Still am.
I was surprised when I read that Washington Post piece. I mean, they had the data, but it seemed to me like the wildfires have gotten an enormous amount of coverage, but I guess not compared to hurricanes. The Washington Post made another good point in that piece, and that is an enormous amount of the coverage of the hurricanes are before the hurricane ever makes landfall. So you have a huge amount of coverage of where's it going to hit, the predictions, this will happen, that'll happen.
Evacuation stories.
With the wildfires, it hits, and there is no prediction. You're just covering what's happening.
And it hit much faster in this case than anyone anticipated, which is part of the reason for all of the devastation.
And you can be in a hurricane, you can't stand in a fire.
Yeah, no, exactly. No, Anderson Cooper cannot be waist deep in a fire the way you can after a hurricane. No, the hurricane, the before that anticipation, and then there's a mystery to the story, because where is it going to make landfall? And yes, the people who may or may not evacuate, and then the aftermath. I mean, there's more built in that makes it an ongoing, extended story. But I don't dispute there's East Coast bias.
I agree. There is an East Coast bias. When I used to work for NBC out of the LA bureau, we were always fighting for attention to stories that were happening on the West Coast. Part of the reason is because a lot of the shows are out of New York. You look out the window, and that's what you cover, right? Something that you can relate to. But I do think that, and I hate to use this term, but it is, when you're covering a hurricane, it's a lot more entertaining. And it was touched on that, where people are blowing away in the wind and they're in water and so forth. So it's built for television. With fires, they often happen. A lot of fires are happening all the time that we don't even hear about, because they're burning swaths of land without homes. And so it's a less intimate kind of coverage. Now, it does move into areas, and as we saw there, it can be quite catastrophic. But I think there are two different things, and to compare the coverage of them, I don't know that it's apples and apples. It's a little difficult to align the two.
I would agree with that. When you've got a natural phenomenon, a natural disaster like a fire, you can't parachute in and do stand up in your trench coat from the closet. No. And you've also got this sense over on the East Coast of, yes, this is horrible, but it doesn't impact us. What's the long-term effect? And they don't see it. So they assume their viewers don't care to see it either, I think.
And I will say one other thing. While it may not have been covered with the intensity that we often see at the network level, fires are covered wall to wall in local television.
True, local.
Yes. When I was in King TV in Seattle, I was over in Eastern Washington all the time, and we did round-the-clock coverage of these wildfires. And ultimately, that's where I think a lot of people get useful information. So it is being covered, maybe not on the nightly news.
It would have been
or
wall to wall
ABC.
on the cables if it were
Right,
outside of New York
it would,
City.
but it's still being covered.
Yeah,
it's still
it
being
is.
covered.